Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Medieval Reader. So today is a video that I take very seriously. It is my favorite video to make and also my favorite videos to watch. And that's my top 10 favorite books of 2017. The reason why I say that it is the most important video is that I tend to highly rate most of my books on Goodreads. I give 4 and 5 star ratings to nearly everything I read. However, most of what I read isn't very memorable. It doesn't really have a huge impact on me. This list includes all of the books that have had the greatest impact on me during the year. These are books that have resonated with me, that I really recommend to people interested in similar kinds of books, so books dealing with similar themes. And they are all phenomenal books. I don't necessarily always have 10 books that I recommend. Sometimes I will have a top 5 list or even a top 3 list if that year I didn't read many great things. But this year I decided I would do a top 10 list, although, as you will see, not all of the books have had the same kind of impact on me than those at the very top of the list. So let's begin. And by the way, for all of you who are celebrating, Merry Christmas. So at number 10, as the book that has had the least impact on me, but still has had a great impact on me, is Harlequin Polished by Love by Marivaux. In French, it's Arlequin Poli par l'amour. Harlequin Polished by Love is a one-act slapstick comedy by the 18th century playwright Marivaux. He was inspired by the Commedia dell'arte, and Harlequin, indeed, is a clown in the Commedia dell'arte, but he's modified for a French audience. And in this story, there is a fairy who falls in love with Harlequin, even though Harlequin is just not interested in her at all. He's just interested in eating and sleeping, and so it's really funny how much passion the fairy has towards Harlequin, and he has absolutely no interest in her. He's just interested in satisfying his own desires. And then Harlequin falls in love with Sylvia, and well, I don't want to give it away, but it is incredibly fun. It's not necessarily a profound story, but it is my favorite of Marivaux's plays, and I read 3 this year, including his famous The Game of Love and Chance. I thought that Harlequin Polished by Love was the best. If you like slapstick comedy, I think you will really like it. Even if you don't, it's not as brutal as, say, Double Inconstancy, which is a bit more violent. This one is mostly about the puns and about Harlequin's presentation, how he carries himself. He is like a clown. It is just so much fun, and so I had to include this on the list because I've thought about the character of Harlequin multiple times during the year. Number 9 is a book I just finished reading, The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. Now this was actually a reread. I read it for the first time in February 2016, but I have no problem including on my favorites list books I have reread, because I've read it in that year. Boethius was a 6th century consul, and actually his sons were joint consuls during the reign of King Theodoric. But in 523 he was unjustly accused of treason, and while awaiting execution and under house arrest, he wrote Consolation of Philosophy, which is this fictional dialogue between him, Boethius, and Lady Philosophy over a number of big philosophical questions. Justice, God. It is Christian, but not overtly Christian. It is very influenced by Neoplatonism and Stoicism. It deals with questions about free will, about why there's evil in the world, and about fortune. This is where the Wheel of Fortune becomes introduced into Western thought, is through Boethius, who also translated a number of writings of Aristotle. So we wouldn't even have access to them if it weren't for his translation. So Boethius is actually a very important historical figure. Unfortunately, he was brutally executed in 524. Shortly after finishing Consolation of Philosophy. It is really, really interesting, especially if you like Stoic philosophy. If you're interested in some of the wisdom that I think could be very relevant for those in power today, I will link my most recent blog post, which doubled up as a review of Constellation of Philosophy. Number 8 is something that you won't usually see me talking about at all, let alone see on a favorites list. And that's a graphic novel. And that's Goliath by Tom Gauld. Goliath is a retelling of the story of David and Goliath from the perspective of the giant Goliath, who is defeated by David. And the story is told from an anti-war perspective. It is really, really interesting and has really changed the way that I read that story. I highly recommend it in this political climate. And the drawings are actually really beautiful. I really like his artwork. I'd like to read more of his graphic novels, so I will include a few in the video. Number 7 is Go Set a Watchman by Harper Lee. I know that this book had a very mixed reception because Atticus Finch is not the very attractive lawyer that we get in To Kill a Mockingbird. But I like this one so much more because I felt that it was the most real. It really represented the average white man living in Alabama in post-civil rights America. It's hard to read because Atticus is racist, but it's also really human because it's told from the perspective of a girl who loved and admired her father, and she has to learn to wrestle with the complexities of her father. It's an amazing coming-of-age story. I know for myself, as I was getting older, when I was growing up, I was starting to learn that my parents aren't perfect either, and learning to love people who are flawed is, I think, one of the major themes in this book, and very important for young adults in particular, but also for people who are starting to realize how complicated the people they love the most can be. And I think it's also important to read today because we like to think of ourselves as having successfully reintegrated African Americans into our society, but white privilege is still a huge problem in America and something we don't want to acknowledge. So reading a book like this, I think, will be, maybe more helpful than To Kill a Mockingbird. But I definitely think that if you read To Kill a Mockingbird, you should read Go Set a Watchman. I really, really enjoyed it. And I thought that the writing wasn't good because it was clearly a first draft. It doesn't seem like Lee intended to have published this book, but I am glad that it was published because I think it really gives us a more complex perspective on Atticus Finch. Number 6 is We the Drowned by Karsten Jensen. I am a sucker for seafaring novels, and this is a book all about this Danish town, Marstal. It's a shipping town, and in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, shipping was brutal. I mean, I suppose it's still brutal today, but what I mean by brutal is, from a very young age, boys are whipped in school to become tough. It isn't about learning at all, it's just about being tough. And then when they're on the ship, they are whipped all the time so that they can be able to withstand the harshest of conditions. This is the exaggerated masculinity in this novel would not seem to be something that I like, but actually I like it quite a lot. For some reason, I feel like I'm encountering the darkest sides of humanity when I'm reading these novels. It's very existential because while it's about being on a ship, it's also about being on your own and being outside of society and learning how to survive. The first half of the story follows Albert Madsen, who is in search of his father. His father had been a prisoner of war during the Danish-German War in the late 19th century. And through Albert's eyes, we get to see the transformation of Marstal into a shipping powerhouse. The second half of the book is about Knud Erik, who is probably not as interesting a character as Albert Madsen, but he is considerably younger. He's 15 years old. We get to see what it's like to be on a ship in the early 20th century. So this is in the next generation. Albert Madsen represents the older generation of shipping. Knud Erik represents the newer generation. And his mother, who's a widow, is also a shipbroker. And it's just really interesting to see, again, through the eyes of these two men, the transformation of this port. And also, it deals with bigger questions about love, about what men have to leave behind so that they can enter into this brutal world of sailing. I really, really recommend it. It is a beautiful book, as you can see, and it's one that has been hauled by a number of booktubers, but it doesn't seem like many booktubers have read it, so I really do recommend it, especially if you like travel novels. Number 5 is The Colonel Chabert by Honoré de Balzac, Le Colonel Chabert in French. And this follows a man, the Colonel Chabert, who fought for Napoleon, but now he's living during the Restoration. And he has survived this war, and his wife thinks that he's dead, and she has remarried. And so he is alive, but he can't just walk up to her and say, "Hey, I used to be your husband." It's not that easy, because she's actually benefited from his supposed death. And this book is quite tragic, but beautifully written. The descriptions are exquisite, as you would expect in Balzac, and a really interesting social commentary on Restoration France. It is a novella, by the way, so it's very quick and very short. You could probably read it in a couple settings. Now we're reaching some of the best books. Number 4 is Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare. This play blew me away. I read it twice this year, and it was worth it. I think even more so the second time around. The writing is beautiful. The characters are incredibly powerful. I really initially liked the character of Cassius quite a lot, and I thought that he was genuinely interested in toppling a tyrant, but then you come to see that actually he has quite a lot of ambition, and I felt like this was a perfect play to read in the current administration in the United States. So I really, really like Julius Caesar, and it's definitely my favorite Shakespeare play, even more than Richard III, which surprised me, because I really liked Richard III. I enjoyed particularly the Masterpiece Theater adaptation. I have not seen any adaptations of Julius Caesar, but I would really love to. Number 3 is The Art of Biblical Narrative by Robert Alter. The Art of Biblical Narrative is one of the few studies on the Bible that looks at the narrative structure of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament here. It looks at not only when these different stories were written, so, for example, the 2 creation stories, or the story of Abraham or Jacob, but why the redactor put those stories together in this book we call Genesis. It looks at also the role of repetition and a number of other rhetorical techniques in the Old Testament. And it just transformed the way that I was reading the Old Testament, because the entire time I'm thinking about the historical context, and historical context matters, but it is also literature. And therefore, why don't we apply the same tools we use to study literature, fine literature, to the Bible? Surely they were aware of these techniques. And I think that if you are at all interested in biblical studies, you definitely should read The Art of Biblical Narrative. It was phenomenal, and it's a book I definitely would like to reread next year. Number 2 is Don Juan by Molière. The English is Dom Juan, or The Feast of the Statue. And this is Molière's, the 17th century playwright. This is Molière's adaptation of the story of Don Giovanni. So in the play, Don Juan is a libertine. He has affairs with a number of women, I think over 1,000, but he's also married, so he marries women and then he leaves the town and marries other women. So he is just a disgusting person. I mean, he's really corrupt, he's amoral, like there's no moral standard. It's not that he's immoral, as if there's a moral standard that he's violating. He's amoral, there's no morals for him. And yet he's an incredibly complicated and compelling character. It's so funny because it doubles up as a commentary on the strict Catholic rules in 17th century France, but also about what makes a person compelling. It's a very strong character study, because in comparison to his squire, Don Juan is really an interesting character. His squire is pathetic. He doesn't really have a lot of character. He's supposed to be Don Juan's conscience, but you can see how Don Juan really tricks you into wanting to know him more and to wanting to be his friend. At times I was even rooting for him, even though he was hurting all these women. I don't know, it just really messes with you. And I really loved it. It's definitely my favorite of Molière's plays. So if you want something fun that'll make you laugh out loud, that'll make you think, that'll make you wrestle with moral questions, I highly, highly recommend Don Juan by Molière. And number 1, the greatest book I read in 2017. In a way, I'm kind of cheating, because I began it on New Year's Eve, 2016, but I finished it on New Year's Day. I have mentioned this book multiple times on this channel, so you probably already know what number 1's going to be, but it blew my mind. I have never read such an incredible translated work in my entire life. And that is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, translated from the Middle English by Keith Harrison. This poem is translated so brilliantly. He keeps the alliteration in his translation. It is also incredibly atmospheric. It's about Sir Gawain, who is confronted by the Green Knight, who is beheaded, and yet he doesn't die. And so now it's Gawain's turn to face the axe. It is... It's profound in the questions that it deals with. It is beautiful because of the descriptions, and the translator is magnificent. I would love to read other translated works by Keith Harrison. I am so ready to reread Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and I would like to read it out loud. It is supposed to be read out loud according to the translator's preface. I felt that this was my favorite book of 2017, even though I did not read it out loud. So can you imagine how amazing it must be if I read it out loud? So there you have it. Those are my top 10 books of 2017. Let me know if you read any of these. I highly recommend all of these for anybody who's interested in similar works, because I think these are some of the best books in those categories. And I will make another video soon talking about my goals for 2018. I hope you guys all have a wonderful holiday, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.